Good evening, good vach, and happy Chanukah. If you look at your schedule in the where, when, and when, you will see that there is no lecture tonight. The series resumes next Saturday night. However, since it is Chanukah, I'm sharing with you a video of a lecture I gave in 1994 on the history of Chanukah for your enjoyment, for your edification, and to make sure you'll have something intelligent to watch while your Hanukkah candles are burning, if you so desire. Again, I wish you all a happy Hanukkah, and we will, Mir Hashem, resume our Saturday night lecture series next week.
Big night. You took my opening line. I was going to thank my wife. Okay. I don't know if you remember exactly what the title was, but basically I intend to speak tonight about Hanukkah, the history of Hanukkah. There's a lot of discussions. There's a lot of discussions in terms of Dvar Torahs and various sorts of interpretations of, what the meaning of Hanukkah is and so forth. Maharal, wrote a whole book on the subject. That's not at all what I intend to speak about tonight. I intend to confine my remarks more to, as far as I can, the history of the period which is responsible, because of its complicated nature, for making Hanukkah the least understood of the holidays in terms of what actually happened. The problem is not unique to Hanukkah. Actually, when you think about it, most of our holidays are not clearly defined in the original sources. For example, Rosh Hashanah is not referred to in the Chumash as the beginning of the year, is it? For the first day of the 7th month. It doesn't say anything about Rosh Hashanah or Yom Hadin even. We're not told why Yom Kippur is Yom Kippur. Why is it a day of atonement? We're not told in the Chumash that Shavuos is the date when the Torah was given. We're not told why Sukkot should be celebrated on the 15th of Tishrei. What's special about Sukkot being on the 15th of Tishrei? I thought they sat in Sukkot all year long for 40 years or wherever. However, Hanukkah is unique because Hanukkah doesn't have any sources. Chanukah is post-biblical. It happened after the period of the Tanakh, as we all know. So, at least for all the other holidays, the ones that are Doraisa, meaning that they're in the Chumash, we have Psukim, in which the Chazal are able to darshan and explicate and elucidate the various meanings, the layers of the holiday, the halachos. And even the other post-Chumash holiday, which is Purim, we have a Megillah Esther, which is part of the Tanakh. And again, there's a whole Masechta, as you know, devoted to tearing apart and analyzing in the minutest detail the various Pesukim in the book of Esther in order to explain for us as much as possible what Purim is all about. But when we come to Hanukkah, we do not have any of this. Hanukkah is really post-biblical. It is after the entire period of the Tanakh. And furthermore, I always start off by pointing out that Hanukkah, we have no information about in rabbinic literature. All the stories that you and I have heard of since we were children, such as the story of Matisyahu killing the guy at the altar and saying Mila Shem Elai, or Judah Maccabee, or various things that they did when they went to the base of Midrash. All this is not found in what we call Chazal, in rabbinic literature. It's not in the Gemara, it's not in the Talmud Bavli, or Yerushalmi, or the Medrash, or any of the ancillary literature of the Tanaim and the Amoraim, or anything like that. All the stories that we know of Hanukkah, that we've heard since we were children, are from a species of literature which theoretically is prohibited for a Jew to read, and that's called the Apocrypha. Okay? In fact, they're all found in this book, first book of Maccabees, right? Which is not a Hebrew book. You look and know it's Greek and English, meaning that it's a part of a body of works, a bunch of books that were written after the Tanakh, after the Bible, as we understand it, was codified and canonized in the time of the Anti-Semitism. And when the Anti-Semitism sealed the Tanakh, and they said that these 24 books are in, and anything else is out, the anything else is out that they were referring to was this, and other books of that type, meaning books written in the time of Bayis Sheni, which according to the Mishnah, at the end of Sanhedrin, is prohibited for any from Jew to read, and not only that, but it says Hakari Svarim Chitzonim Elo Chelek Olam Haba. Anyone who reads these books like this, right, has no portion in the world to come. See? That at least is the definition of the Talmud Yerushalmi on that Mishnah. Okay? You'll ask me then, well, how can somebody have a book like this? Are we on tape? If you really are very interested in the halachic aspects of it, wait until the art scroll Sanhedrin Kayla Shlishi comes out, where I can assure you there's a long footnote about 15 different paragraphs on the subject. But very briefly, the Red Fund, the Meiri, and all and it's in the following context, that the Gemara itself quotes from the Apocrypha, from the book of Ben Sira. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have heard of it, but the Sefer Ben Sira was a Hebrew book, written at the time of Bayis Sheni, at the time of Shimon HaTzadik. It is more or less a from book, but there's nothing, at least that I can recall, being objectionable in it, and most of it. And the Gemara, sometimes Darshanists discuss it back and forth. They're not sure what to do with it. And the question, all the Rishonim says, well, how can you even bring up such a thing? I thought the person who reads such a thing is Ein Lo Chelik Olam Haba. Well, the Gemara doesn't answer that, but the Rishonim say, well, it must mean, obviously, that you can read it, you can't learn it. So you can't treat it as Torah. See? We don't read Gemara. We don't read, hopefully, Mishnayos. We're not even supposed to read our prayers. But we learn them. So you can sit with a charusa or something like that, and each word has significance. If someone treats any of the apocryphal literature in that way, then there's something wrong with it. Then he doesn't understand the sharp distinction we draw between what is the Tanakh, what is canonized for us, and what is outside, what is forbidden. But if a person just wants to read it for the information, then he may. That's the bottom line in the halacha. There's a Ritva about this, there's a Meiri about this, there's a whole bunch of Rishonim about this in different places. So there's nothing wrong necessarily with having the book. However, how did this even survive? The Frum Jews, the Chazal, the Anti-Semitism, the Sanhedrin, made a campaign against this, as is evident from the words of the Mishnah, to suppress this literature. And the reason they did so is because they didn't want this falling into, by accident, the Tanakh. They didn't want people blurring the distinction between what is sacred and what is not, and making this part of the Bible, which the Christians did. This has survived in the Greek because it's in the New Testament. Okay? And the reason it's in the New Testament, even though it has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever, is the Christian church at the very beginning, whenever they put their Bible together, included all of these books, 14 in number, plus a number of others besides that, in the New Testament, and they did it for their particular reason. And the reason they did it was because otherwise they had a big problem. And that problem is, we have, as you know, what the Christians call the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, the Old Testament was over 500 years ago. Then there was no more Nevi'im, no more Ruach HaKodesh, no more nothing. And all of a sudden now you're claiming that it started off all over again? Doesn't make any sense. It was a hard claim to support. Therefore, they had to maintain, and they did maintain, and they do maintain, that it's not true that the Bible ever ended. That's what the Jews say because they're very bigoted. But in reality, it continued along all the time. And these books that we're referring to here are just as Kodesh as anything else. And therefore, the whole period of Ruach HaKodesh goes from the Old Testament through the Apocrypha into the New Testament. It only ends at the end of the New Testament. So it's a matter of being tendentious more than anything else. However, for our point of view, and especially because tonight we're talking about Chanukah, it so happens, ironically, as I say, all the information, or 99% of the information that we have about the holiday of Chanukah, is found in basically the New Testament, if you wish. See? It's not in there. It's not. I use. If you understand what I said, it's not a question of being in the New Testament, but it's in those Greek works written by Jews, which they included. And there you have it. So there happen to be, there's 14 or 15 of them, and there's Maccabees. The first book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, the third, the fourth. The third and fourth have nothing to do with Hanukkah whatsoever. They have nothing to do with anything, but the first and second do. And the first book of Maccabees is the source of all the stories that become very popular. The source of all the stories that we've ever heard of. You see? And it's more or less, and how more and how less I will try to explain later on. That's a very controversial issue. It's more or less a Frum book, which gives a straightforward account, written from the point of view of a Frum Jew, of the events of this period. You see? And I don't want to spend a great deal of time doing the literary analysis of the first book of Maccabees, but you just take it from me. That originally was written in Hebrew, and more or less is written from a Frum point of view. However, as you see, for us, as Frum Jews, this is quite problematic. Because if I were, as I mentioned earlier today, to write down, copy down all the Chazals that I've found anywhere on the subject of Chanukah, in terms of the Maccabees, the story of Chanukah, and all the rest of it, I wouldn't even be able to fill a page. It's very, very little. The word Maccabee doesn't exist in rabbinic literature. Okay? It's a Greek word. And this book is from the Greek. It's called Maccaboi. Nobody even knows exactly what it means. They're only guesses. But as I say, what we've learned as children with the Mi Kamocha B'Elim Hashem or something like that is a made-up thing. Because we can't darshan a word that doesn't exist. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's possible it's true. Anything's possible because we don't know. But it's pretty far-fetched. And it's not like there's a Gemara over there, which Rashi or the Mefarshim are going into, and there's some kind of Masorah as to the derivation of this word or something of that nature. There's nothing like that whatsoever. Judah Maccabee doesn't exist in Chazal. Many of the things that we know about Chanukah do not exist in the Chazal. There is one source, really, aside from a few lines here and there in the Gemara. There's only one source that has any information in terms of Chazal on the holiday of Chanukah, and that is a book called the Megillas Tainus. Okay? Megillas Tainus is a short treatise, which is a list of days. It's like a calendar. And it's really a bunch of days during the year, about 40 or 50 of them, when it's also Lemishbud Bahon, also Lisanis Bahon, those who learn Gemara know. These are days in which were recorded famous events that happened to the Jewish people, post-biblical, in the time of Bayesheni, which were considered sufficiently important to treat them like half holidays. They're not Asher B'Asiyas Malacha, you can go to work. It's more or less like a Lag BaOmer type situation. Or a Chanukah situation. Chanukah is one of the holidays mentioned in the Megillas Tainus. It is the only holiday that survives. The Gemara even says, black and white, in Tainus and Shabbos, Batla, Megillas Tainus. All the other days in Megillas Tainus have lost their legal significance. It is no longer, for example, prohibited to fast on the 23rd of Iyar. It is no longer prohibited to fast on the 6th day of Sivan, of Elul. Right? 23rd of Iyar is when they finally tore down the great fortress in Jerusalem. It was a big day, and it's mentioned there, and there's a whole celebration. The 6th day of Elul is when Herod dropped dead, and that was a big, wonderful occasion because he was out to kill everybody. And there are many days like this, you see, but they all have no significance to us whatsoever, halakhically speaking, with the exception of Chanukah, which is the only day in the entire calendar of Megillas Tainus, which is more than one day, which I'll have to speak about later, because that's of extreme significance for the understanding of the origins originally of what Chanukah is all about. The original Takonos Chazal, which is found, as I say once again, in the Megillas Tainus. If you look it up, I'll read it for you, I hope later on. If you look for under the entry of month of Kislev, on the 25th day of Kislev, then you'll find that it says over here on the 25th of Kislev is the day of Chanukah, 8 days you're not allowed to fast or have a hesped, and then there's a certain description over there. This book, the Megillas Tainus, is the only book that was permitted by religious Jews, by the Chazal, to be published after the Tanakh and before the Mishnah. See, it is the sole piece of literature that was published. As you know, we have a tradition of Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, an oral law and a written law. The Torah Shebiksav had to be written down. The written law, many think incorrectly, was not allowed to be written down. That's not true. You could write it down, but you could not publish it. Okay? So no books were published after the canonization of the Bible. Okay? Now, a lot of people kept notes. Yoshua ben Nun kept notes. David HaMelech kept notes. People kept notes and so forth. But there's all the differences we know, if any of us has ever taken a class, between the notes we have in our notebook and a published book. And no book was permitted to be published. The Rambam speaks about this at great length for those who are interested in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah. It's very famous. And also in the introduction to the entire Mishnahs. That being the case, we see the significance of the fact that they made an exception in this case over many, many centuries to allow the Megillas Tainus to be written at all. The Gemara says that the reason they did it was Chavivin Aleim Yisurin. That there was the sufferings that the people had endured were very meaningful for them. The people who had lived through these horrible times and had seen these good occasions were determined that such a date should not be forgotten. For example, if you lived in the time of Hortus, it was worse than living under Stalin. And the day he died, many people said, we're going to live. Our children are not going to be wiped out. Our family's not going to be destroyed. This was unbelievably significant. And they determined, and the Chazal went along with it because they agree with them, this should be written down and never forgotten. Other facts of great historical importance to us, they couldn't care less about. But the position of Chazal in general is they couldn't care less about history. That is unfortunate for those of us who are trying to find out what happened way back when. But the general tradition of Chachamenu, Zichrono Livracha, was that they're not interested one bit in history per se, and what happened as such. Any story that's written in the Tanakh is not written in the Tanakh because to inform us of the history of that period, but is strictly written there for Musar purposes. If we find any history of David HaMelech, or the kings of Israel, or anything like that, or the story of Purim, which may be a slight exception, because as you know, the story of Purim they never wanted to accept, and Esther sort of pushed it into the Tanakh against their will. But leaving aside the Megillah Esther, the other books that are there, even if they have any stories for us, are strictly there because in the opinion of Ezra and Nehemiah and whoever it was that canonized the Bible, they held that this is going to be a good Musar Haskell for generations. As the Gemara puts in the Megillah, Nevuah shetzrich l'daros nitnu l'hikasev. Nevuah she'ein tzrich l'daros lo nitnu l'hikasev. Any nevuah, any prophecy, or any information that had a permanent value in terms of its Musar to us today, down the ages, was permitted to be written down and perpetuated. Anything else was cut, no matter how interesting. We would love to have the original book of Shmuel or Yoshua and have all the more information about them. I mean, we would love to have any sliver of evidence we would have of Avraham Avinu or anybody like this. It would be, we yearn for it today, we who are more historically conscious in the 20th century, let's say, the modern period. But we don't have it. That's it. Now, in that context, you see the problems of trying to grapple with Chanukah. The only information we're going to have, as I told you, is going to be found in terms of Chazal and Megillah's times. There is a few other places here and there, but very, very little. It doesn't amount to anything. Okay? Russia is on Pesukim and so forth. I could sit here now and spend the next 3 minutes going through them, but it'll be no point. So that is what I want to start with. And that is to say that when we deal with the problem of Chanukah, we have a problem of sources. The main source that we have is a non-Chazal source. It became famous in Jewish history, even to the time of the Rishonim, through the history of Josephus, who lived about 200 years after Chanukah, more or less, the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Many people have heard of Josephus, who was not a from Jew either. As a matter of fact, well, he was a traitor, but that's not the point. The point is that the history book he wrote is flawed, especially from our point of view, by the fact that even though he lived in the time of Chazal, but he didn't like them. He was a member of the Saddukim, more or less. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but this is not the time to go into it. Basically, Josephus was not a from Jew. On the other hand, he was not from Chazal. He liked history. He was interested in it, and he wrote a very famous fat volume of history, which basically is the only history book we have, unfortunately, of the Bayis Sheni period. He wrote it in Greek when he was living in Rome after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. He had joined the Roman army, and it became famous, as I say, because it's the only source we have for many of these stories. I'll just tell you something aside. We've all heard about Masada. You've been in Israel, you've been to Masada. The only source that there was ever such a thing called Masada is in Josephus, who wasn't there. He says, a Roman soldier told me such and such a thing happened. Now that doesn't mean it's not true. When, 20, 30 years ago, they went and excavated it, in Echanami, most of the stuff worked out. It was indeed as he had described it. But, again, an historian is interested in the degree of source reliability, as they say. So it's not in the Gemara, or anything in the Chazal, or even Josephus didn't even see it. It's just, it's Eid Mipaid, as we say. It's a third-hand source. Which is why many, many times I'm asked, and other people ask this, well, were they right to kill themselves in Masada? Were they not right to kill themselves? And so forth. And it's impossible from a halachic point of view to make any statement whatsoever, because the halacha doesn't know of this. See, the Gemara and the others don't discuss this, and therefore we can only treat this as, so to speak, as I say, a second-hand kind of incident, and we have no idea whether they were religious Jews or not religious Jews, and what the situation was. Because when all said and done, we are not going to base, a Torah opinion on something found in Josephus. Okay, is that clear? If there are any questions, by the way, I don't mind it at all.
They had a mikveh there, right?
That's correct.
So I made sure they were.
That's a point in their favor. Yeah, that is true. On the other hand, without going into, I don't want to get too much off the subject, the bottom line is the people that were there were from the Circa, the extreme zealots, to whom the Chazal were opposed. So don't make the mistake of saying that someone at that time who wasn't from was what we call today Now, there were people at that time who would argue with the Chazal and not keep certain laws, and might be very strict on the laws of purity. As a matter of fact, you've all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those people were a bunch of nuts. That's true. They were a bunch of nuts, but they were very big on purity. See, so they had a lot of mikvahs there. But they were crazy. They thought the world's about to come to an end, and they had their own laws and everything. See? Having said that, like I said, I don't want to get too far off course. We're going to speak tonight, therefore, about Chanukah, but I needed to make this in terms of a introductory statement, even, no matter how long it takes, because you won't understand the problem unless we deal with the sources. Now, to the story. Chanukah itself is somewhat complicated. We all remember that the Jews had been under the Persian Empire after the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar Babel. 70 years later, the Persians came in, and the Jews were for a period of 150, it's not clear exactly how many years, under the Persians. And when Alexander the Great came and destroyed the Persian Empire, and he succeeded to the rulership of the world. I mentioned before today that Alexander the Great, the famous story with him is that he conquered the world, or at least all the world outside of China and Far East, and was really a god. He called himself a god, and everybody acknowledged he was a god. And he had, think about this. The guy ran the whole world. See, he was absolute ruler. But when he came back from his last campaign, he threw a big party and drunk himself to death. And he had a 3-day drinking party. Okay? And that's right. He had a 3-day drinking party. He wanted more and more and more. His servants were afraid to tell him to stop, and therefore he drunk himself to death. Which is I can never forbear to point this out, that this is for sure, at least in my opinion, the source for the famous Chazal in Pirkei Avos, which says, Ezo Gibra Kovish Yisro. Who is the hero? The person who can control himself. I'm talking about Chanukah tonight, so I'm not talking about Pirkei Avos, but I'll just tell you this, that every mimer in Pirkei Avos, or in Chazal in general, but certainly in Pirkei Avos, was not said abstractly as an aphorism or a proverb, something cute or clever, epigram, but we're all based on concrete situations. And you'll have to take my word for that for the moment. But every single saying in Pirkei Avos is historically based. The first parak is easy to see that. I mean, that's obvious. Okay? The first parak is easy to see because they go down the zugos. And if you just know a little bit about the time in which they lived, you'll see it black and white. If you know a little bit of Gemara in a few cases. The other chapters of Pirkei Avos are not that easy to see, but I guarantee you that I can point it to your satisfaction. And here again, you have Ezo Kibra Kovish Yisro. The arch example of this is Alexander the Great. I mean, he could conquer the world, but he couldn't conquer his addiction. See, that's the greatest irony and most philosophically profound statement you can make about the man. You see? Well, after Alexander the Great died, he didn't think he was going to die at 33, so he left no will or anything like that. Or, according to an alternative version, he left a bunch of wills. But the bottom line was that he had a baby that was killed, and therefore his generals struggled over who should control this great empire that he had erected. It took a 20-year civil war with a lot of people getting killed until finally, at the end, 3 guys emerged on top, and they founded dynasties that ruled the world, which is called the Hellenistic world by world history, the Hellenistic era, because these 3 guys had been generals of Alexander the Great. He was Greek, Macedonian Greek, and he advanced the Greek culture all over the world. And for this 200, 300, 400 years, all of the Middle East and into Asia, into India and Pakistan, the Greek language and the Greek culture was dominant. It's amazing. For a short period of time, all the local cultures, which are so strong and rooted in the Middle East, were just like knocked out. And instead, the Greek culture, temples, language, coinage, culture, literature, dominated everywhere.
What year was Alexander the Great?
Alexander the Great died in 322 BC, something like that, and I think that's exactly 322, so figure it out. So 322, and then by the time the Romans come in, it's about 300 years later, more or less. Right? So, and the Romans, in a certain degree, also picked up a lot from Alexander the Great, but like I said, we won't go into that right now. The point I'm saying is, how did it impact upon the Jewish people? The Jews were mainly concentrated in Eretz Yisrael and in Bavel, but the Hellenistic culture impacted and profoundly upon the Jewish people. In fact, we've been permanently affected by it ad hayom hazeh. The very form, in fact, of the ultimate organization of the Mishnah and the Gemara and all this has a lot of Hellenistic influence to it, in terms of its types of organization. And the best example I always give in my class is that the Gadol Ador, after Shimon HaTzadik, was whom? As we know from Pirkei Avos, Antigonus Ishtocho. You look in Pirkei Avos, in the third thing in Pirkei Avos, he's the one who says, don't serve the master in order to get a reward. That's very famous. Now, I repeat, what was the man's name? Antigonus of Socho. How do you get a great rabbi with a name like Antigonus? That is as Greek as you get.
Yeah, really.
Right? It's like I always say, if we didn't, instead of Ramosha Feinstein, you had Rabbi Walter Feinstein, Rabbi Harold Feinstein. You see, these are not names that we associate with great Rabbanim. And this obviously wasn't just his Gaisha name, this is used in the Mishnah. Yeah. It's not like, his name was Avram, and at work he called himself Antigonus. See? This was his name. So what does this tell us? That even in the most elevated Torah circles, you see, there was a very profound degree of acculturation. Okay? So people didn't think that this is strange, or whatever, however we want to explain it. Many of the, by the way, the names of the Chazal are non-Jewish names. Trifon is a very Greek name. And there's a whole bunch of them. All which speaks the fact that, there was a certain, we can't deny, that the Jewish people were impacted very heavily by the Greek civilization. The Jews also, like everyone else, were knocked down, and they said, wow, this is unbelievable. This culture is so amazing. As I always point out, until the Greeks came in, fat was in. Ever since the Greeks, skinny is in. I mean, who made that up? Right? Why? It's all a matter of taste. But it became, from then till today, the standard of what's called good looking. You see, they brought it in. The entire Greek style of architecture and of what's considered a class, and of literature and literary forms and so many other things are all taken from the Greeks and have incorporated into Western civilization. A lot of the things we do are Greek. We don't realize it. Okay? College, obviously, but even before in sports, it's the big deal because, I'll go into that later if I may. The point is that this had a tremendous impact upon the Jewish people. It's good to remember once in a while, if we look down the entire period of Klal Yisrael, that we have had, as a people and as a religion, a couple of big challenges that knocked us out for a while. And then other challenges weren't big at all. The first of the great challenges was that of Avodah Zarah. The Torah was given against the context of Avodah Zarah. Avraham Avinu emerged in a world of paganism. The entire world was polytheistic. It's not a question of them worshiping idols, it's a question of believing in a multiplicity of powers, because they said, listen, it makes sense. There's day and there's night, there's hot and there's cold, there's so many different things out there. It bespeaks different intelligences. For the Jews to come along and say, no, there's one intelligence behind the whole thing, and then to try to explain why is there good and evil and all the rest of it was a revolutionary idea. And a lot of the Jews, as we know, didn't feel so great about it. I mentioned before that the Chazal included certain books in the Tanakh and left other ones out. And they did so for a muster purpose. What is the message, the story behind the experience of Klal Yisrael in the time of the Nach? It is a sad one. It was Judaism versus paganism, and paganism won. Right? We were in Israel for 800 years or something like that. And it was supposed to be that the Jews were supposed to set up their society and at least not be affected by the Goyim. And it didn't work. The great majority of the Jewish people completely collapsed and were destroyed. It's the 10 lost tribes. That's Rov Binyan of Klal Yisrael. What's it all about? Because in spite of the Nevi'im and in spite of all the others, and in spite of the Torah that was around, the majority of the Jewish people, for a variety of reasons, went for the Egel Azov. They went for the Baal and the Asherah. You see? And the result was that Hashem warned them over and over again, and when things reached the limit, they were destroyed by Ashur. And what happened to the rest of the Jewish people in Yehuda? The exact same thing. They would not listen, despite all the Nevi'im and even the good kings and all that stuff. And we talked about this in the keynotes of Tisha B'Av. and they were destroyed. The only thing is, since the Rebbeinu Shalom promised that the Jewish people would never be totally destroyed, and he wanted to cure them, or however we understand it, so instead of being totally wiped out as the 10 lost tribes were, they were exiled to Bavel. And by the time the Jews came back from Babel, by the time of the Second Temple period, we have the remarkable phenomenon that the Jews are no longer interested in paganism. Never again in Jewish history, I repeat, never again in Jewish history do we find any Jewish interest in the idea of Avodah Zarah, of paganism, even though the rest of the world still was. You see, it's almost like there was an inoculation at work. The Gemara, as many may know, speak about the fact that Ezra and Nehemiah had to pray specifically and ask Hashem to be mavakel the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah. However, we understand that the historical fact is that in the Second Temple period and afterwards, there was no interest in Avodah Zarah. When we're going to speak later on about the Hellenistic Jews at the time of Chanukah, let us remember that these people didn't really believe in the gods of Greece. It was strictly politics, strictly power involved. You see? The second great challenge the Jewish people faced was this point of the Hellenistic civilization, which was so powerful and pervasive everywhere. The Greeks presented a whole worldview and systems of philosophy, mainly of superstition, however. It's a big mistake to think that everybody was a Socrates or a Plato. Very, very few were. The primary Greek civilization was a certain crass Avodah Zarah, if you want to get down to it. Tricked out with fancy phrases and a little bit of Stoic philosophy thrown in, but ultimately it didn't stand scrutiny, as I may explain tonight, or I may not have time to explain tonight. But this is really the kind of, during its time, it was amazing. It's hard for us to understand today the attraction it's had because we're living in a different time. But believe me, it was very, very powerful. And the Jewish religion, again, almost buckled. We almost went down just like everyone else. Chanukah has something to do with this. Just to jump ahead a little bit and give you an idea of what I'm talking about, in the Middle Ages, you see, there was no such great challenge to Judaism. The Jews lived in a Christian world and in a Muslim world, in tiny, helpless minorities. We do not find in the Middle Ages, for over 1,500 years, that the Jews were, felt, oh my goodness, how are we going to face the challenge of Christianity? How are we going to deal with Islam? The Jews thought, look, Christianity is crazy and Islam is contemptible. They didn't feel a challenge, per se. If the Jews were ever involved in debates, they were forced into it. They couldn't care less. So there's all the difference in the world, if you follow me, between the challenge to Judaism posed by Hellenism and the challenge to Judaism posed, for example, by Christianity. The Christian thing was a physical danger. The Hellenistic ones was a cultural, a danger of values. In the modern period, however, as we know for the last 200 years, most of the Jewish people stopped being religious because Jewish people, again, have almost been knocked out by the challenge of modernity and everything that involves. Right? We have today a whole different set of values. My goodness, we're in the 90s. We have every day new sets of values being thrown at us. But so we see 200 years ago, 99% of the Jews in the world were from. Today, I think it's the other way around. Something happened, and this is the challenge of modernity. I think that speaking today, at the end of the 20th century, we can say that those who have survived have survived. In other words, anyone who's decided by now to be from doesn't feel the values of current civilization to be a challenge to his mindset. But this was not true of our, parents, grandparents, relatives, and so forth that we see all around us. This is plain and simple.
Isn't this not too dissimilar from the Hellenistic world? I mean, it was a...
If you want to argue that, but my point is...
It was all modern, it was all new Chinese.
Yes, absolutely. At one time, Avodah Zarah was modern and new. See, that's the point of it. Now, to cut to the Chanukah story. The Jews had been ruled by Alexander the Great. Then when Alexander died, they split the kingdom up in several different ways. The Jews originally ended up falling into the Egyptian empire. In other words, one of Alexander the Great's generals grabbed Egypt. And as I always put it, you have to understand, to be very blunt, to understand the situation in the Hellenistic world, you're dealing with mafias. You're not dealing with kings. Right? They were kings, they founded dynasties, they had armies, but they were strictly mafias. It's not a question of values. These people had no culture whatsoever. They ruled by total force. And basically they would kill anyone that disagreed with them. Their whole power lay in having a big mercenary army, which meant that all their power lay in having enough money to pay the army. Their number one priority in life, and the number one priority to preserve their life, was to have enough money to meet payroll, If they did not, they were killed, their wives were killed, their children were killed, their friends were killed, their animals were killed, their houses were burned down, everything. And therefore, you had the type of person that survives in such an environment and becomes a king is not a nice person. It's not a person with culture, not a person with any sensitivity. The reverse. So all the Ptolemaic kings, and all the Seleucid kings, and all the other kings you wanted to, and anybody who was a ruler whatsoever in these 300 to 400 years of the Greek civilization that we speak about with such grandeur and glory were nothing but a bunch of godfathers. And I use that term advisedly. I'm not exaggerating, I assure you. These people were people who plotted to kill their own children killed their fathers, wives against husbands, poison, this, that, and the other. You could make 10,000 soap operas and it wouldn't come close to reading 3 pages in Plutarch or Polybides. Right? That's the way it went. That's the world. I'm not that sure if it's so different today, so we shouldn't go, wow. But at least in certain countries, right? I mean, honestly speaking, in certain countries it's like that today. But these were the leading powers of the ancient world. And these are the people in whose hands the Jewish people fell. So the Jews were for 200 years controlled by the mafia called the Ptolemaic dynasty of India, for 100 years, of Egypt, I beg your pardon. And then, after 100 years, the other one got them, the Seleucid dynasty, which had its headquarters in Syria, which ruled a good part of the Middle East, and they took over Eretz Yisrael. It was one of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus IV, who is the villain of the Chanukah story. However, that, as I will show you right now, is a little bit of a mistake. Not that this guy was a tzaddik, as I just pointed out to you, none of these people were nice people. Right? All these people were murderers. However, the fact of the matter is that in the Hellenistic world and in the Roman world, there was almost never any persecution of the Jewish religion. This is a very interesting fact, and it's an example of the, Etzbel Elohim that we always talk about in terms of the survival of the Jewish people being a direct manifestation of divine providence. Frederick the Great, there's that famous story where someone was talking with him, and he didn't believe the guy was an atheist. And he said, well, how do you explain this? And how do you explain that? And he had an answer for everything. And he said, well, how do you explain the survival of the Jews? And he said, well, you got me there. I'll think of one, but I don't have an answer for that now. Because it defies so much the logic. Yeah. In the Hellenistic world, as I say, you're dealing with a bunch of absolute murderers, all of whom protected the Jewish religion. They're Jewish subjects. Okay? Now, they did it for a variety of reasons. They wanted the taxes, they wanted this, they wanted whatever kind of, whatever reasons a dictatorial ruler protects a minority. But the fact of the matter is that the Jewish religion was considered a licit religion, in the Latin term, religione licitas, all during the period of the Greeks and all during the period of the Romans. Alexander the Great, we know from Goyish sources. Okay? The Gemara has a whole story about how he met the Kohen Gadol, about Nazim, and all the rest of it. Forget that for the moment. The Goyish sources tell us, if you read the old chronicles, that Alexander the Great issued a series of decrees which more or less favored the Jewish religion. And I don't remember all of them. I always remember one was that he offered he says any Jew who joins his army will get to keep kosher. But more, I don't think many Jews joined his army. But you never know. One that makes more impact is he says the Jews do not have to pay taxes during the Shemitah year. Right? Which is interesting. You wouldn't expect it from a guy like Alexander the Great, who was a ruthless person if there ever was one. See? He also, if I recall, allowed the money that would be sent by the Jews all over the world to the Beis HaMikdash to be free of taxes, which is, again, a remarkable sort of thing. And we don't know, by the way, if once he got into power, he might have revoked these. Because we're dealing with such dictators that one minute they feel like this, another minute they feel like that. So the best thing it's very possible that by him dying from over-drinking at a party, the Jewish people may have been saved from a terrible fate. We don't know that. But whatever the case is, it ended up with the best scenario for the Jews, because here you have the paragon, the god of the Greek world, the greatest hero that will ever be, Alexander the Great, who said the Jewish religion is a legal religion, it has rights and all the rest of it, you see? So nobody could come later on among the Greek anti-Semites, and there were plenty of Greek anti-Semites, and very vicious ones, and the earliest species of anti-Semitic literature dates from the Greek world. But what could they do? Doggone it, Alexander the Great said that it's not a cult, that it's not barbarous, even though they do such horrible things as circumcision, which to the Greek mind was just the worst thing they could imagine. And they didn't mind killing babies, huh? But they consider the Greeks have a cult of the body. You understand that? I mean, I'm sure many of you know that, right? They're the cult of the physical and of the body. So to mutilate the body, which is what they understood it being, is a great cultural offense. So the Jewish values and the Greek values in this case are coming from two diametrically opposed worldviews. They cannot communicate. They don't understand each other. Okay? And we'll see later on that when in the wars of Chanukah and the decrees of Antiochus, one of the foremost decrees of the Greeks was against circumcision. They thought, I'm sure, in their mind, they are really doing the best thing for the Jews. They're trying to wean them away from barbarous customs. The way today we would look at, like the British banned wives from burning themselves when the husband dies in India, according to the Hindu custom. And I'm sure from Hindus think that that's crazy. But the British say, oh, we know what we're doing. That's exactly the way the Greeks, who considered themselves to be civilized and the Jews to be barbarians, looked upon the fact when they prohibited the Jews from circumcision, for example.
But if a baby was born disabled, to throw him out the
That is true. Well, some countries, yes, some no. That was Plato did that. Yeah, some did. Therefore, as you see, the fact is that religious persecution of Judaism was foreign to the Greek world. As a matter of fact, the primary form of Greek worship, religion, I mentioned this earlier, was sports. You didn't go to church on Sunday and then afterwards go to a ball game. The ball game was church on Sunday. I mean that seriously. In other words, if you were Greek, whatever day of the week it was, I don't know what their holy day was, but the point is that their religion was practiced in a public mode by going to a stadium where there were teams from this city versus that city, which competed, and you had to pay a certain small price to get in, and when you got in at the ticket gate, you also offered a small carbon of an offering of meal or something cheap so that the average person can afford it. And then when you got there, before the game, they had the anthem of the city, first this city and then that city, and then there were a couple other songs there. Then they would have the game, and the winning side, everybody felt great, and the losing side, everybody felt bad. And this, of course, this has survived, as you know, down until today. We've only secularized what is a Greek religious custom. Instead of singing a religious song, we sing the national anthem. But ultimately, it doesn't make any sense. Why do I care whether these bunch of guys win over those? You see, so I'm from Baltimore. That doesn't make any good if they win. But we think this way. This shows you how much ancient Hellenistic ideas have penetrated even into the modern consciousness. Right? I mean, people do. You cannot deny it. People do feel good when the home team wins. My goodness. But it's originally a Greek idea where you say like this. He said, well, if this is my team from my city, and it's representing, so to speak, my god or goddess, then we're having a symbolic fight, struggle between two gods, and this one wins. That shows that our side is stronger. And somehow or other, I mean, I'm not a Greek religious person, so I can't experience it. But that's what they experienced. You see? So this shows you that every time somebody goes to a ball game, they're really going to something which is, in the real sense, real sense, chukas agoyim. I'm not saying you can't go to a ball game, but we're speaking here from a historical and a puristic point of view, and it is. It is more chukas agoyim than Thanksgiving. Right? It has, because the definition halachically of chukas agoyim is something that has its origin in pagan customs. And my goodness, this was the mode of worship. Now, because this was the mode of worship, and because the Greeks were very into the idea that everyone in the city has to come and participate in the games, in the services, because this is how you express your being part of the kahal. It caused a problem for the Jews. A Jew in the Greek period for sure could not go to a ball game. I mean, this was avodah zarah. Plain and simple. It was impossible for a Jew to, in any capacity, participate in any of the sports, because there was no such thing as secular sports. This was the religion. And indeed we find in the historical sources that the Jews were exempted by all the kings everywhere from having to go to the ball games. If you look at the great chronicles of the Greek kings, and even the worst of them, they always say, they have the municipal regulations and all the rest, and they say every Sunday morning everybody has to come to such a thing, except the Jews. Every Wednesday in the third month of such and such a solstice, everybody has to come to public square and sing a song, except the Jews. Everybody has to do such and such a thing, except the Jews. You see? As I mentioned, in the Roman period, the Roman government was very tough on law and order. Everybody has to be inside by 9 o'clock. They had curfews everywhere, except the Jews. Right? You cannot have public gatherings on weekends of more than 20 people, except the Jews. Now you can understand why this whole thing, after a couple of decades and generations, promoted a profound anti-Semitism which spread throughout the entire civilized world. You see? The rulers were thinking in terms of bottom line. The Jews are a crazy, nutty group and all that, but listen, they're law-abiding. If 20 or 30 or 40 of them get together, there's no drunk. Augustus Caesar says, I'll make an exception for the Jews because when they get together for their public assemblies, and he says that even for their common suppers, when wine is consumed, he's of course referring to the Seder and Pesach, and things of that nature. But he says this in the decree. Okay? He says that even when the Jews get together in place where wine is consumed, there is no drunkenness and no disorderly conduct. Well, we can all feel a little bit proud of it. But imagine if I'm addressing a Goyish audience. As they did, they say, something? They say, we're a bunch of drunkards. But the Jews, they're special. What do you think of that? You see? And as a result, the Hellenistic world is the origin of what we call anti-Semitism. Of hatred of Jews as Jews. It's not a matter of a different religion or this, that, and the other. Just doing with the Jews. However, for our point of view, the question then becomes, so why Hanukkah? Because what happened over here to King Antiochus, all of a sudden decided to persecute the Jewish religion, which is so out of step with the normative Hellenistic practice. Antiochus was a bad king, he was a Rosh Marusha, he was a nut, he was this, that, and the other. Say what you want. But the normal policies he adhered to. And as a matter of fact, as far as we know, he didn't persecute the Jewish communities outside of Eretz Yisrael that were under his empire. There were Jewish communities in Antioch, which was the capital of the Seleucid Empire in northern Syria. He ruled during his time Bavel, which, as we know, had a huge Jewish community, maybe larger than the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael. He ruled many of the 127 provinces of Achashverosh and Esther, actually, when you think about it. And as far as we know, there was no persecution of the Jews per se. So, my Hanukkah, what exactly happened in Hanukkah? Now, if you look at, as I say, for better words, our best source, you see something very interesting. If you look in the book of the Maccabees, when they describe the story of Hanukkah, according to them, it was a Jew-on-Jew problem. At the very beginning, in the first chapter, it says, and I will quote you, that after Antiochus IV became the king of the Seleucid Empire, at that time, there came forth from Israel certain lawless men. Now, law in Greek is nomos, that's the Greek word for the Torah. So there were two Torahless men who persuaded many other Jews. And they said, quote, let us go and make a treaty with the heathen around us. Because ever since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us, unquote. The plan seemed good in their eyes, and some of the people went eagerly to the king, who gave them permission to perform the rituals of the heathen. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem in accordance with the customs of the heathen. They also subjected themselves to uncircumcision, and they stood aloof from the sacred law, they stood aloof from the Torah. Thus, they joined the heathen and sold themselves to do evil. This is early on. So we see over here the rise among the Jewish people of another mafia. Right? And I use that word advisedly and fully cognizant of what I'm saying. What happened over here was, and we have to go back a little bit, that when the Jews, after Alexander the Great, ended up being ruled by the Egyptian Empire, the Greeks of Egypt, and then the Greeks of this place and that place, the old system of government among the Jewish people broke down. The traditional system of government among the Jewish people under the Persians, and before, at least under the Persians, was a government fire department. They saw to the streets. They saw to all the different aspects of municipal life. It was government by the rabbis. That's the easiest way to put it. And it worked. Because if we remember who we're talking about in this period, we're talking about people who most of the time were gedolei olam, or something, or people who, more importantly, wanted to be gedolei olam. We're talking about a mindset of the rabbinical world, which, as I always like to point out in my class, believes that if you steal a shama pruta, you're going straight to Gehenna, you'll never get out. Unless you, whatever. That contrast, when you put a frum person of this nature in charge of public funds, and according to Jewish law, you can never put one person in charge of public funds. It has to be a committee. Correct? That's a halacha. So, and halacha dating back to this period. What we're dealing with is a situation of a high degree of probity, rare if ever of scandals, and certainly, even if we would say there were, but we're talking about tiny little things compared to the government by Greek tax collectors, Hellenistic rulers, and mafia dons. The Sanhedrin, during the period that they were ruling, despite who the ruler was, obviously always bent over backward to try as much as possible to lighten the burden on the Jewish people. Because the Sanhedrin and Chachamim were always recruited from the ranks of the Jewish people. As we know, it's famous that they were rich and they were poor and they were this type and that type. All elements of Jewish society were represented in the Chazal. Because the Torah itself is a certain democracy of talent, if you wish. And we know that even later on in the period of the Gemara, the Mishnah I should say rather, which is after this, side by side you would find millionaires sitting with poor paupers. This is the basis, in fact, for the Rambam's famous ruling and declaration that it's prohibited for a rabbi to get a salary. Because he said, what do you think? Hillel was a jerk? Don't you think that Hillel, who was dirt poor, starving, right? His family was starving. And he had somewhat a very, very hard way of making a living. He said, don't you think if he would have opened his palm one time, they wouldn't have piled it high with diamonds? When you consider his popularity? But he wouldn't do it. And he says, none of them would do it. And he goes on and on and on about this. And to prove that anyone who takes the money is wrong. Of course, there were those who disagree with the Rambam, and they said, it's easy for you to talk, you're an MD, you have a good practice. But that's exactly what they said. The Tashbet. But be that as it may, the point I'm trying to bring out is that this was the traditional government of the Jewish people. For a variety of reasons, which time does not permit me to go into, during this period that broke down, you had governed by these Greek kings of whatever dynasty. The bottom line is the bottom line. As I say, they had to make payroll. These other Jews came forward, unscrupulous people, and they said, if you put me in charge instead of these old rabbis, I will see to that you get 50%, 100% more tax money, you'll get it earlier, and so on and so forth. Just don't ask any questions. The kings, who had no time for the fine art of government, they needed the cash, and they need it now, so they said, fine, and that is how, just as in every other place in the Hellenistic world, among the Jews as well, in the middle of Judea, there arose their own mafia, which flourished by virtue of their connections with the ruling Greek dynasty. Okay? First one was a guy named Yosef Ben-Tuvi in the time of the Ptolemies. As I say, it's not important, but it actually developed several mafias. And as you know, just because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys doesn't mean that they're all together. The various mafias fought with each other. And you had clashes in the streets of Yerushalayim and others. And in such an environment, the Sanhedrin's power functionally became nil, because if somebody can commit a murder and get away with it, the Sanhedrin can't do anything about it because he's got protexia in terms of his connection with the ruling powers. And what is the function of the Sanhedrin? So you can get away with murder, you can get away with anything. And this, unfortunately, is what happened. These people are the ones I just read to you who went to King Antiochus somewhere along the line and asked him and solicited for him permission to be enrolled as Greek citizens, to basically convert, and to try to be given complete control over the affairs of Judea. The king didn't think it up himself, and as I told you, it would be very remarkable had he done so, because this was not on the Hellenistic agenda. They did not think in terms of trying to destroy the Jewish religion. But here in Judea, and Eretz Yisrael, the time we're talking about, was a small territory, much smaller than the state of Israel today. It was Yerushalayim, and 20 miles around Yerushalayim in all directions. A very small area. The whole wars of the Maccabees and all the events of this period of Judah, Maccabean and Channuka, took place in a very, very small stage. All the battles are fought in the hills of Judea and around there. And I'm sure everyone here, or almost everyone at least, has been to Eretz Yisrael, and you've all seen the Hare Yehuda. You can easily imagine yourself with all those mountains everywhere, right? All around the place, how it's easy for armies, especially in those days, before the Arabs came in and deforested the whole place, when there were a lot of foliage and fields and forests all over the place. There was like Robin Hood. Just run around mountains and hills and all over the place, and that's how the Maccabees were able to survive. See? I could be a Greek general and see them 6 mountains away. I can't catch them. Now, if they would have lived in Babel, it's all flat area, it would have been a different story. So it's not surprising, as I say, to see that, unfortunately, that this mafia arose, flourished because of its connection with the government, and eventually became so arrogant, as mafias always do, that they're going to have total power and total control over everything. And it is in that context that we have the famous story of Channuka, because they went from here to gain permission from the king, not only to themselves be considered Greeks or Hellenists, not only for themselves to build gymnasiums, but to force the others to do so. And when that happened, things reached a head. Before that happened, however, two very important incidents. First of all, King Antiochus, in the course of his reign, got himself involved in a war with Egypt, as they always did. He invaded Egypt, conquered the country, and then was forced out by Rome. On his way back, he faced the problem of meeting payroll, because they had this large army and the campaign didn't work. And he had to meet payroll. So what do? So the nearest city that had any money was Jerusalem. He ruled the city of Jerusalem. This was part of his kingdom. But he attacked it, and he sacked the base of Mikdash. It says here, after smiting Egypt, Antiochus turned back, went up against Israel, and entered Jerusalem with a great army. He entered the temple. This is all originally in Greek. It hasn't survived in Hebrew. He entered the temple in his arrogance. He took the golden altar, that's Mizbeach Hazor, which he melted down for money to pay the soldiers. He took the lamp for the light, that's the menorah that we are all familiar with from Chanukah. That was melted down to pay the soldiers. And all the menorah's equipment, because they're little golden shovels and brushes and things like that. But he doesn't look at his brushes, he looks at his altar. He took gold. He took the table of the showbread, which is the shofar, the cups, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, the golden adornment in front of the sanctuary. All these he stripped off entirely. He seized the silver, the gold, and precious vessels. He also took the hidden treasures which he found. Taking them all, he carried them away to his own country. He massacred people and spoke most arrogantly. So this has nothing to do with Hellenism. This has nothing to do with his trying to stay back the Jewish religion. This is strictly got to be payroll. And this has nothing to do with cultural values or religious persecution. He needed money. The campaign didn't work out. Jerusalem, unfortunately, was the nearest town. And even though he ruled it, these are the type of people we're dealing with. They didn't mind wiping out their own cities and subjects because they don't think a year ahead. Right? A year ahead, we'll worry about that. Right now, as I say, I have to meet payroll of the army now. If I don't, I'm dead. Therefore, long-term planning, as we speak now in the modern world, was unknown in those days. You see?
The menorah was taken out?
I just read it to you.
How did the whole days happen? No, I thought the menorah was around the end of the second base of Egypt.
Evidently not.
They remade the menorah that Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't even make? Had it be done by day?
We will see. That's exactly the right question to ask. It is very significant in terms of our present day observance of Hanukkah. It is mentioned with great prominence in the Megillus Highness, and what you said, therefore, has set it up very nicely. So we will see it. Listen to this, though. 2 years later, and we don't know why this. I'm going to read you this now, and once I finish reading you these 3 sentences, you will know as much about the subject as anyone else, because this is the only source. After 2 years, the king sent the officer of the Mysians, the mercenaries, to the cities of Judah, and entered Jerusalem with a strong force. He spoke peaceful words to them craftily, and they trusted him. Then he suddenly fell upon the city and dealt it a great blow, destroying many people of Israel. So again, this king sent an army for some reason to attack his own town of Jerusalem. He despoiled the city, burned it with fire, razed its houses and its surrounding walls. They led the women and children captive and took possession of the cattle. They fortified the Ir David. Everybody either knows where Ir David is. That's across the street from the Kotel. You take the bus. That's the Arab one, right? And as I mentioned always, Jerusalem was lower at that time, so Ir David was relatively speaking higher. Anyone who's been in Israel the last couple of years, they've taken those tours, really of the Kotel into those tunnels, I forget what they call them. Is anybody familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You see, they'll show you now how far the floor really was. And you see the level of Jerusalem was much, much lower in those days before one destruction upon another destruction upon another destruction, piled mounds of earth upon it. So anyway, the Ir David, this small area, how big is the Ir David? Silwan, as they call it today, the Arab village right next to Jerusalem. It's not big. Okay, it's a small chapter. It's not very small, but how big? 30 blocks, something like that. So anyway, they fortified the Ir David with a high and strong wall with mighty towers, and they became their citadel. They put sinful people there. Now, sinful people is referring to Jews. They didn't say they put in soldiers. They put in these mafia guys and their families. Men who were transgressors against the Torah. And they entrenched themselves in it. They stored up arms and provisions. And after collecting together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there. They became a great menace and it served as an ambush against the sanctuary and evil adversary against Israel continually. So, from this period, this is all before the problem of Chanukah, the decrees against the Jewish religion happened. About 3-4 years prior to that, the Beis HaMikdash was totally sacked of anything that was worth anything. All the gold and silver, anything, the slightest, any possession of the slightest value was stripped. And basically the business was trashed. Take it from me, because we'll see later on if I have a chance tonight. But when the Maccabees finally come back in, they describe it as looking like grass all over the place, growing out of the walls, looking like a forest. So basically it was trashed. The city of Yerushalayim ceased to exist, in the sense that it looked like Berlin after the war, Hiroshima. Most of the houses are torn down or half torn down. The people were all killed or fled. Those who didn't were carried off into slavery. So Yerushalayim is a ghost town during the entire period of the Maccabean Wars. You see? There is one small area, which is this fort, across the street from the Beis HaMikdash, more or less, which is has a small Greek garrison with the Jewish collaborators, with the Hellenists, Jews, these mafia guys. Okay? And that's the way it goes. And that's what we're dealing with. See? All the other Jews, such as were able, fled. Where did they flee? Elsewhere into the small area, I say it's 20 mile, 30 mile radius around Yerushalayim. And that's where they were. You see? So, this had nothing to do. This was strictly a matter of money. As I always keep saying, it had to be payroll. 2 years or so after this mafia, obviously must have now been hated by every Jew, realized, evidently, this is a judgment I'm making, but I think it's founded on the facts, that, it's us or Judaism. It's a question of power. If the people still remain religious Jews, they'll always hate us and we'll never be at peace. Therefore, we have to kill the Jewish religion. Nothing personal, but chayach hakodem. And therefore, they got permission from the king. I don't want to read the long passages again. And to be backed up by the army of King Antiochus, who never again entered Israel. If you imagined in your minds or read books about wars between Judah Maccabee and King Antiochus, that is inaccurate because the only two sources we have on it talk about the fact that he never again was in Israel. He went off somewhere else, where he died years later, robbing one of his own cities. If we are dealing, as I say, with this period, we're talking about a phenomenon of Jew on Jew, of the Civil War. These people got the Greek army behind them, and they, as only Jews can do to other Jews, went after the mitzvahs of the Jewish religion. I mean, the Greeks may have heard about circumcision. Did they know about Rosh Chodesh? They prohibited Shabbos. Did they know all about the little mitzvahs and ins and outs of Shabbos? Of course not. This is something that only a Jew can do to other Jews because they're familiar with it. And therefore we have this terrible, phenomenon of what we call the Shas HaShema, this great wave of religious persecution which hits Israel, instigated by Jews. Okay? Actually, I will read you a paragraph, but why not? You'll hear it from the original source anyway, and you'll get an idea what's going on. It says, then the king ordered all his kingdom to become one people, everyone should forsake their own laws. Even many from Israel consented to his worship, meaning to worship the king, and to sacrifice to idols, and profane the Sabbath. The king also sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and cities of Judah, commanding them to follow customs foreign to their land, to withhold burnt offerings and sacrifices, that's karbonos, to profane Shabbos, the Sabbaths and festivals, to pollute, to be metame, the sanctuary, the Beis HaMikdash, and the holy ones. There were a lot of Jews who were Nazirim, what we call Perushim, people who led lives of Tahara, which is the whole ritual of living, which is dead today, ever since the Beis HaMikdash. I'm a Kohen. I could not be in this room if this was, thousands of years ago, unless I'd ever been sure that there wasn't a dead body here or anything, had ever been here, and if it had certain things that had to be done. I couldn't walk if there was a sheretz somewhere. You see?
A what?
A sheretz, if there was a dead mouse somewhere. I would have to make sure if it had ever been there. Meaning, if you were, believe me, the laws of Tum and Tara are very complicated, And it meant that a Kohen was always on guard, had to live a different type of life, had to live a life of constant awareness, to never be off guard. This was expected from someone who is appointed by Hashem. This is, being a Kohen was a difficult task in the old days, which is why when they report, if they get truma or something like that, it's a small compensation for leading a very difficult life. So all this is gone. Because the basic English is gone, these rules become disuse. But in those days, they were, and now they're told to pollute the holy ones, to build high places and sacred groves, and idols, sacrifice pig's flesh and unclean cattle, to leave their children uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of uncleanness and profanation, so that they might forget the Torah and change all the ordinances. Whoever would not obey the order of the king was to die. And it goes on to say that on the 25th day of Kislev, the 146th year, this king ordered the erection of an abomination of desolation upon the altar. Now, an abomination of desolation, this is in Greek, is a Hebrew word. We know from the Sefer Daniel, which a great deal of Sefer Daniel talks about this, if you choose to interpret it that way. Shikut Shomein. Any of you have ever read Daniel? Shikut Shomein is the worst form of imprecation that can be found in the Hebrew language. It's the greatest revulsion and disgust. And they can't, in the Tanakh, and in here, the Jews cannot bring themselves to use the words. They put an idol on the altar. A Jew couldn't, he just couldn't say it. You see? It's so disgusting. And different. They put a horrible object, an abomination of desolation. That's, in ancient Hebrew, that's the worst way you could describe something like this. And the Greeks did this, officially converting the base of Mikdash into a pagan temple on 25 Kislev. Right? He erected an abomination of desolation upon the altar, and in the surrounding cities of Judah, they erected altars. They burned incense at the doors of the house and streets. In other words, they went around every Jewish house, so burn incense in the house, and that turns it into a base of what is art from the Jewish point of view. So, you understand, if you're Jewish, this wrecks your house, which is on purpose, that you want to do that, in order that the Jews will feel that they have no choice but to go along. The books of the Torah, the Torah scrolls, the Sefer Torah, which they found, they tore into pieces and burned. Wherever a book of the covenant, any kind of copy of the Tanakh was found in anyone's possession, or if anyone respected the Torah, the decree of the king imposed the sentence of death upon him. Month after month, they dealt brutally with every Israelite who was found in the city. On the 25th of this month of Kislev, they offered sacrifices upon the altar, which was set on the altar of burnt offering. In other words, they officially started a round of Lahavdil, carbon tumid every day, Avodah Zarah, for Greek deities, once a day, twice a day, whatever ritual was, on the 25th day of Kislev, which is the winter solstice, and the different significant pagan rituals, and so forth. This has always been the great retort, which many non-Jewish scholars or non-religious scholars, whatever, did, not anymore, but years ago, when they said, well, Hanukkah is really a pagan festival. So what are you talking about? Well, everybody knows. 25th of Kislev, that's the winter solstice or something like that, which is a well-known time in the Greek religion, and therefore you see, so even the ancient Jews were into this stuff. And the answer is, of course, these guys are stupid. They never even read the book of Maccabees, which is later on we'll see that the Gedavka waited on the 25th of Kislev to restart the base of Mikdash as a base Hamikdash, because they wanted to match the day that the Greeks had converted into theirs. You see? So it has nothing to do with being a pagan festival, the opposite. Somebody have a question?
So isn't it winter solstice? Wouldn't that be?
I don't know if it's exactly the winter solstice, whatever it is.
It's the solar calendar, not by the lunar calendar.
Right. What does that have to do with anything? Maybe the Greeks have to, I don't know.
So the 25th of December might be solstice, the 25th of
I don't know. There's something, I'm a little off on that. You can get me later. I can think here somewhere. It's winter solstice or some sort of astronomically significant time of the month.
That year, but it wouldn't be the solstice.
Is there something in the moon at that time? Around Kislev? Nothing?
I'm not
Okay.
sure.
Or it could be, by the way, wait a minute, I just realized the answer. They didn't go by the Hebrew month of Kislev. Obviously, it was there December. You see what I'm saying? It comes out to our month of Kislev.
Right.
So it must have been some month in their calendar where something, some sort of significant event. What you have to do is get an astronomer and go back. I mean, seriously, I did this once on a computer program. The 25th of Kislev, when Hanukkah was a Wednesday. For those who are interested. My father-in-law got this little calendar, which you can go forward or back as far as you want. Put it on my computer, and I went back to the year 165 BCE, and you look up 25th of Kislev, and you see it's a Wednesday night. Now, anyway.
You match it up with the solar age?
I'm trying. But look at this. In accordance with the decree, they put to death the women who had circumcised their children, hanging the newborn babies around their necks, and they also put to death their families, as well as those who had circumcised us. Nevertheless, many in Israel were firmly resolved in their heart not to eat unclean food, and they preferred to die, and so forth and so on. So this is basically the background of the story of Hanukkah, which was something, unfortunately, instigated by Jews, against Jews, with no religious basis whatsoever, but strictly for political reasons, in terms of naked, hardball power politics. And we bore the brunt of this. You were dealing with people with no conscience. You were dealing with, as I say, mafia types. We're in it strictly for power. And all this makes us realize the horrible sort of people under whose rule the Jews were now suffering, with the full backing of the army of King Antiochus and his forces, who was really basically thinking in terms of getting more money. It's an amazing example of indirection. Now, at this point, the story we're told over here, which is slightly varying, very slightly varying to a version that was found in a rare Medrash, but we'll go basically with this story, is, of course, that, once they took over the city of Yerushalayim, then it was a question of spreading it out to the rest of the small area called Judea, and they came from one town to another and imposed these rules upon the Jews there until they came to the town of Modi'in, where I'm sure all of us know that Matisyahu was there, and he killed the guy that was going to do this, and when he killed the person that was going to offer up the carbon, that meant that the fat is in the fire, and that it's going to be a war. And when he killed the Jew who was going to sacrifice to the pagan altar, and he killed the Greeks who were with him, the Greek soldiers that were with him, he had to flee. He had to flee to the hills. As I told you, we realized the terrain at that time wanted to flee to the hills. The Greeks, in this period, were heavily armed soldiers, not really good for mountain fighting. The Jews had the advantage of having no weapons and no armor, so they could run around a lot. And this is really what happened right away. The person that Matisyahu killed, obviously, was one of these traitors, whatever you want to call them. The word traitor doesn't do justice to it. The word criminals does. It's not a question of politics or allegiance. It's a question these people are thugs. They're using religion, as it were, as a cover for expanding their own power and agenda, as it were. And anyway, he fled, and he had no choice. The point I wanted to bring was, well, anyway, what happens over the following year was very interesting. There is in West Point, the American Military Academy, a series of 22 or 23 statues of great commanders in world history. Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Frederick the Great, whatever. And one of them is Judas Maccabeus. The only Jew among them. Now you'll tell me, so how do they know about Judas Maccabeus? Well, yeah, I told you it's in the New Testament. And, they know this better than most Jews. Right? I read their Bible most of the time. Jews is, unfortunately, I teach this, so take it from me, most Jews don't know the Bible. It's a sad state of affairs. Now, the reason that Judas Maccabeus is called, and they got it from the Greeks, that are right, we can't say it's Yehuda Maccabeus, we have no idea what it's like to do. The reason he's put there as a great military commander is because he's considered the founder of guerrilla warfare, which is very interesting, especially for those of us who remember the Vietnam War. Because what they do right now is protect what has been fought in all guerrilla wars ever since. And that is that what Matisyahu and the others proceed to do is, in the mountains, a very small number, say, like this, they said, well, we're going to kill the bad Jews. They don't go and attack the Greek army. There's no point that they're not going to win. You see. What they do is they wait till nighttime, and then they would go into villages, and if there was anybody who was a member of the Hellenists or something like that, Jews, they would kill him. If they would find the baby who was uncircumcised, they would circumcise him. Now why would they? If there was an altar set up in the area, they would tear it down. This is a political move as much as anything else. Do you see the point of circumcising every uncircumcised baby? You're forcing that family to make a choice. You see? If they have an uncircumcised baby in the family, they say, uh-oh, this is how we're going to get killed. We might as well join them. So this is what happened. It's horrible. It's very brutal. Well, they're living in a brutal time. And we're also told, very interestingly here, and this is one area where the book of Maccabees jives very strongly with the Gemara, the Gemara about Azara, that there was this incident where a bunch of Jews who were religious ran away, hid in a cave. The Greeks found them. We're going to attack them on Shabbos. They said, come out. They wouldn't come out. The Greeks came in and killed them. They wouldn't fight back on Shabbos. They asked me, why wouldn't they fight back on Shabbos? Well, halakhically, this is perfectly sound reasoning. Because many are aware that in Jewish law, there's what we call the big three. Gila, Rai, Shvichas, Dam, Avodah Zarah. Yehar, Bal, Yavar. That if someone comes and puts a gun to your head, it says, eat this tray sandwich or I'll shoot you, you eat the sandwich. Yavar, Bal, Yehar. If someone puts a gun to your head and says, do such and such a sin or I will kill you, you do the sin. Because your life is more important than that particular mitzvah. However, the big three, Gila, Rai, Shvichas, Dam, Avodah Zarah, which your life is not more important. If someone puts a gun to your head and says, shoot that guy or I'll kill you, you have to allow yourself to be killed. Because you're not more precious than him. If someone tells you to do an act of pagan worship, or I'll kill you, you have to let yourself be killed. And if someone tells you to commit an act of immorality, however that's defined, one has to allow himself to be killed rather than do that. This is very famous, well familiar. Those who know the halacha well will know that that rule of what we call the big three applies in normal times. B'shas hashmad, when there is a missionary campaign against the Jewish religion, when there's a wave of religious persecution against Judaism per se, all of the Taryag mitzvahs become the big three. In the time of a shmad, if there is an effort to destroy the Jewish religion or attack it, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, eat this sandwich, you must die. Because that becomes the front line. Every mitzvah, when Judaism is under attack, is as important as any other mitzvah. I always call this the red shoelace rule because the Gemara says you can't even change the color of shoelaces. If the Goyim are wearing red ones and the Jews are wearing black ones, you can't even, and a guy puts a gun to your head and he says, change it to red, to Arkansas and Messiah, change the color of your shoelaces, you should die because that is a significant act in the context of that kind of campaign. Therefore, the story of what these people did in the cave is very understandable. Well, it's Shabbos, the big attack, fight back would be Machal Shabbos. It's a Shas Hashmad. You're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to violate the slightest mitzvah in a time of Shema. So even if it means that we will all be killed, that is what Torah requires. Okay? And they said we are dying against all justice, and God should be our witness. What happens up here? However, let me read you this paragraph, and then I'll tell you what the Gemara says.
We weren't attacking them to make them a Machal Shabbos. They were attacking them to destroy them.
No, that's not true. They said come on out and convert whatever, and everything will be fine. It was a strictly religious thing. I can read it to you if you want. They said to them, "This is enough. Come out and obey the command of the king, and you will live." But they answered, "We will not come forth, nor will we obey the command of the king to profane the Sabbath day." Okay. And they died. Now it says, when Matisyahu and his friends heard this, they mourned greatly over these people, and they all said to another, quote, "If all of us do as our brothers have done and do not fight against the heathen for our lives and our laws, they will soon destroy us off the face of the earth." Then they made the following decision, quote, "If any man attacks us in battle on the Sabbath day, let us oppose him, that we may not die as our brothers did in the hiding places." This is known in the Gemara, in Avodah Zarah, as one of the two famous takonos of the Bezin Shel Chashmonaim, which is you can fight back on Shabbos. And the idea behind it is obvious if you choose to follow this line of thought, and that is, if you're attacking me, Stam, because you want to change your religion, is one thing. But if I'm Mechal Shabbos by killing the guy that's trying to get me to be Mechal Shabbos, that's not called being Mechal Shabbos. I'm preventing the person from making me be Mechal Shabbos. In other words, I am breaking the Shabbos in order to protect Shabbos. That's a tricky line of reasoning, and it's not something that every individual does on his own. But as a Bezdin, they said that this is the policy that should be followed, and this, of course, is the halacha until today. This is why, halachically speaking, quote unquote, in the state of Israel, they remember the Yom Kippur War and all that kind of thing. There's no question about fighting back on Shabbos or Yom Kippur, whatever it is. You follow what I'm saying? The whole point is, what, am I supposed to be stupid and let this guy go and shoot me? That's crazy. I'd rather kill him because he's trying to get me to be Mechal Shabbos. That's one of the two famous takanas of the Beis Din Shel Chashmonaim. The other one, interestingly enough, I'll tell you right now, is the other famous takana that he did was to prohibit yichud with a non-Jewish woman. Okay. Strictly speaking, the Jewish law, Minaраisa, prohibits yichud, a man being alone with a woman, with what we call an ervo. You know, someone to whom he's privy. For example, a married lady with someone other than her husband, or a person with a relative who would be considered incest who's not a very close relative or something like that. You know, various rules and regulations. Didn't apply to Goyim. They're not considered, they're not. It's not an incestual or whatever relationship. So, but in the time of Beis Din Shel Chashmonaim, the Gemara Revolt tells us that they prohibited yichudim with non-Jewish women, which means in the context of these wars there must have been problems, that mandated that. But be that as it may, early on you see this kind of problems arising, and this is the sort of issue that they had to grapple with. Matisyahu, according to the story, died about a year after this whole thing started, and on his deathbed he made a famous speech, which you can never trust in these books when people make deathbed speeches, because that's very, very much in the style of Greek literature. We'll see later, we won't see later on, but believe me, when Judah Maccabee gets killed in battle, it says he was pierced by 44 arrows, and as he died, he said, "My brethren, as I lie here dying, I want you to continue this program." I know, but he pierced by 44 arrows, and then he got a speech. But this is part, that's right, this is de rigueur in classical literature. Nobody dies like that. They always say something memorable. Go out. Everybody says something famous. Now, and of course, what it means is he must have said something like this, or at least he wanted to say it. He would have. Well, to move on, what happened here from this point on, and I'll speed up a little, is that they started hitting, as I say, all the Hellenists, and just like happened in Vietnam, very interesting. What they did was they dominated the society. They made it impossible for any person who was not a religious Jew to live outside of a fortified area. See, if you were a Hellenistic Jew or someone who sympathized with them, and you live in a village, they're going to bump you off. They would come at night and kill you. And then they would disappear. And by the time people called for help from the Greeks, soldiers or something like that, they would be gone. This is guerrilla warfare. And what you really are trying to do is you rule the night and you rule the countryside. At nighttime, you're the king because you know where you want to go. And in the country, you can't have soldiers everywhere. They can only have them in fortified or concentrated areas, especially when they had these professional armies with armor and all that kind of thing. Thank you. Thank you. Therefore, within a short time, at least in certain sectors, the initiative went over to this very small group of guerrillas. You see? Now, when Maccabee came along, what happened was like this. It says, the Greeks made them, you see that there's two levels, I hope I've made this clear, to this revolt. One is against the Jews, that's the real struggle. And unfortunately, it's also against the Greek government because the king, who's attacking my soldiers? And what happened was they didn't take it seriously in the beginning. So first this guy named Apollonius, who was like a local police chief, went to attack him and got wiped out by Judah Maccabee. Then, according to the story, a guy named Siron, who was the governor of a larger district, let's say a police superintendent, head of state police, you might say, he came with an army and got beat badly, lost 800 men, until finally he realized this is not a local incident, this is going to be blossoming into a full-scale revolt of a certain type. And so now it becomes what we call the Maccabean Revolt. Under the leadership of Judah Maccabee, all the information I'm giving you is found only in the book of Maccabees. There's no mention of the same girls.
Who wrote this book?
Oh, we do not know. That's a very good question. We do not know. It obviously was a strong, hot Jew, by the way he writes. You've heard some of the passages I read.
Is this credible?
That's the question. If it's not credible, I don't know because I wasn't there. If it's not credible, then we have no information on copies. That's the point I'm trying to get at. It's clear that there's a fair amount of credibility to this. You can't deny it. Because the way he describes a great deal. If you take my word for it, or if not, you'll read it yourself, you'll see that whoever wrote this was an eyewitness to a great deal of this stuff. He says, in the Greek army, half a line on this side, and when they appeared, you could see the shine of their armor on the dawn sun, and things of this nature. You see that these are eyewitness accounts. Having said that, does that mean that I know if every bit of this is true? No. That's the problem I started with tonight. Okay? Now, until finally, as I say, the thing blew up into what was regarded as a full-scale revolt. King Antiochus realized he had a problem on his hand. As I told you, he realized he was going to have to increase the size of the army and send it down to suppress this revolt, which meant he needed more money, which meant it was harder than ever to meet payroll, which meant that he had divided his army into two parts instead. He went off to the east to try to squeeze money out of the provinces there to pay for the whole thing. He never came back from there. He stayed there for a year or two, 3 years, something like that, and he died there of some kind of disease, of a sickness. He left his best friend named Lysias in charge of the other side, meaning the part of the empire which was Syria and Eretz Yisrael. This guy Lysias, who became the regent of the Seleucid Empire, organized one campaign after another, just like the American army went against Vietnam, with one wave after another. Or, you know, your world history, just like what happened now is very similar to the Dutch War of Independence against Spain, where the Spanish sent one army after another army after another army, and the Jews basically were in the position of they always have to bat a home run, because you could never afford to miss once. If they have to win every battle. Israel, unfortunately today, faces this problem, the state of Israel. They have to win every war. They cannot afford to lose a war. The Arabs can afford to lose a war. They can send another army, another army, another army. We can't afford it. Same thing at that time. And as it happened, Yehuda Maccabee beat them. As I said, I don't want to go into each and every, the detail of each and every battle. If I had a great deal of time, I would do that. But it's amazing. And if you read the tactics he used and the other things, you begin to see why he's considered one of the great commanders. Oliver Cromwell, for example, who never lost a battle, always carried the Maccabees by his side. Because he always copied the tactics, and other great generals in history. But a great deal of this had to do with the fact that Yehuda Maccabee had a fanatical army at his side, very small, 2,000-3,000 men, 4,000 men sometimes. And it's very interesting. In one battle, for example, and I say I don't want to get too bogged down in this. In one battle, for example, it was like 3,000 against the 46,000. And so, on the eve of the battle, he assembled the soldiers, and to psych out everybody, he first of all said, as the Torah prescribes, at least from Muhammad's Rishus, anybody just got married, out. Anybody just built a house, out. Anybody just planted a vineyard, out. You know that rule. And anyone who's scared, anyone who's scared, out. You'll tell me, how can you afford to do it? The truth of the matter is, it's very smart. If it's 3,000 against 46,000, it's not a difference whether it's 3,000 or 2,000 against 46,000. It's not going to make a difference. So you might as well have a hardcore, at least the people who were there want to be there. And as the Torah says, don't make the others scared as you are scared. And second of all, the remaining troops, what he did was they had found, as we see today in Holocaust museums, desecrated Sifrei Torah, upon which the Greeks had written all kind of pagan or pornographic design in mockery. And they passed these in front of soldiers. And remember what they've done to us. Look at this. And they took out replicas of the big day Kohen Gadol. And he says, we no longer have a Kohen Gadol. Remember this. And of course, by the time he finished, you're ready to die. Right? These guys are ready. And they beat them. It's amazing, 2,500 against 46,000. This is, as I say, it's not in the Torah or anything else. It's written in the Greek annals. It's absolutely amazing. And there was a series of several battles, which they sent one army into Vienna, another army, and one army into Vienna. Now let me tell you right now, whether you know this or not, in the long run, Yehuda Maccabee lost. 6 or 7 years later, after this, he was killed in battle by the Greeks. The story of Channuka takes place in Arrested, in between two of these battles. After he beat Lysias the third or fourth time, what basically happened was the Greeks came with a huge army. First they came with 46,000, then they came with 55,000, then with 75,000, then with 100,000. It's amazing. See? And the Jews at the peak, according to this, never had more than 10,000. See? Now, what we're dealing with is a case where they're always coming again and they're always beating them off. In between one of these battles, that is to say, when Lysias was beat the third time, he was discouraged and he said, as I tried to explain to him, he said, well, next time I'm going to come with an army of 120,000. And the Jews knew that he had 6 or 7 months to, until he goes back, reorganizes, and comes back, and even longer. And it is during this period when the Jews had won this battle. It turned out to be the month of December. And what he did was, the month of December. Now that the Greeks are out for a short while at least, for 6 months, the Jews said, well, now let's take over Yerushalayim and take over the base of Mikdash. And that wasn't hard if you followed me. What was Yerushalayim? Nobody was in Yerushalayim. You have to fight to capture the city of Yerushalayim. It was a dead city, a ghost town, deserted. The base of Mikdash was deserted and trashed. There was, across the street from the base of Mikdash, a Greek citadel. But the main body of the Greek forces was away. Is this understood? And I will read you what it says here about Hanukkah. In fact, let me read you the preceding paragraph. Oh, I'll read you 2 paragraphs. The following year, this is Lysias. He gathered together 60,000 picked men and 5,000 horsemen to fight against the Jews. They entered Edom, meaning they came into Jews from the south, and encamped at Beit Sur, where Judah Maccabean met them with 10,000 men. When he saw how strong the expedition was, he prayed and he said, quote, and this is all in Greek, so I can't give it to you in Hebrew because we don't have it in Hebrew. He said, blessed art thou, Savior of Israel, who staved off the charge of the mighty man by the hand of thy servant David. Now, evidently that's referring to, David and Goliath, double Goliath. And you delivered the camp of the Philistines in the hands of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and his armor bearer. That's a famous story in the Tanakh, at Michmash, where the son of Shaul climbed up and defeated the entire army. So it's these things that Judah Maccabean saying before soldiers can't happen. In the same way, him and his camp, right hand of thy people Israel, let them be put to shame, in spite of the mass of their army and their horsemen. Make the enemy cowardly, melt the boldness of their strength, let them quake at their destruction, cast them down with the sword of those that love thee, and let all know thy name, praise thee with hymns. Unquote. So you see, and then, by the way, they used to fast. Now we got, which is against military strategy, but as I say, if you got 2,000 men, throw away the rule book. Then they fell upon each other, and there fell many of the army of Lysias, about 5,000 men, and they ran away from them. When Lysias saw the growing rout of his army, and in turn the increasing boldness of Jewish Maccabees, and how ready they were to live or die nobly, he marched away to Antioch, went home. There he levied mercenary troops in greater numbers, that he might come back again against Judea. So as I say, this was the last battle of Beit Sur. Now they respite for 6 or 7 months. Okay? Judah and his brothers then said, quote, now that our enemies are crushed, let us go and purify and dedicate the sanctuary. So now the enemy wasn't crushed.
So they thought that they weren't coming back.
And they're not for a while. Right?
Well, what do you mean? They didn't think they were coming back at all, or they just...
That's obviously incorrect. They knew they were coming back. The Greeks always come back.
Well, what does crushed mean? Crushed.
Interpret it however you want. They weren't stupid. They knew they could. He did come back not long after. Okay. So, by the way, I don't disagree with the point you're making. Meaning,
what do you think? That's not what
I understand. What do you mean crushed? Nevertheless, you see the situation what it is. But the Greeks did not leave. They are coming back. He wasn't killed. The army wasn't destroyed. They just been beaten back. They had come back 4 times. Come back another 4 or 5 times. Anyway, now our enemies are crushed. Let us go purify and dedicate the sanctuary. As I say, they come and take over the base of English. They come to Yerushalayim, but they find the city totally empty. The entire army gathered together and went up to Har Zion, Mount Zion. Now, do we know all here where Har Zion is? That is not within the wall of the old city. It's off. Unfortunately, today, Har Zion is a church. So you can't go there. It's kind of funny. The whole Zionist movement named it Har Zion, which is a church. But whatever the case is, I mean, I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean, it's an unfortunate fact. But, it's off to the side beyond the Armenian section and so forth. But it's a hill from which you can see very clearly the Beis HaMikdash. They saw the sanctuary desolated and the altar profaned, the gates burned up, and weeds were growing in the courtyards, as like in a forest or on the side of a mountain, and the priests' chambers were torn down. This is the scene that they see when they come back to Yerushalayim. The Mishnah tells us even more. There's a Mishnah, famous Mishnah in Mikos, which describes the Beis HaMikdash more or less shortly before it was destroyed by the Romans, many years after this. And there was a rule, if you read the Mishnah in Mikos, that there were 12 or 13 places whenever you walked by in the Beis HaMikdash, you had to bow down and prostrate yourself. Right? Because imagine being a Kohen and say the Beis HaMikdash, every 20, 30 steps you have to bow down every time you go by there. And the reason was those were the great gaps, torn in the hole, breaches in the walls of the Azara, of the Beis HaMikdash, torn by the Greeks, which it says when the Hashmonaim came, when the Maccabees came, they repaired those breaches. And therefore, for our purposes, we must imagine the Beis HaMikdash as this huge fortress-like structure with gigantic gaps all over the place, torn in there by the Greeks as part of their trashing program. They tore their garments, the Jews did, and they made great lamentation and put ashes on their heads. This is Judah Maccabee's army. And they fell upon their faces to the ground and blew solemn blasts upon the trumpets and cried out to heaven. Judah appointed certain men to fight against the garrison of the citadel until they could cleanse the sanctuary. In other words, they might go in the Beis HaMikdash, but across the street, a little beyond that, not even that, I mean, it's basically across the road. Across the road is this big Greek citadel, which can shoot at them. So what he said was, he said, oh, you know, take half the army, whatever, you guys conduct a siege, fight against this Greek fort and keep them busy, while the rest of us can take care of the Beis HaMikdash. So all during the time of Hanukkah, we have to understand it. You know, in Maccabees, they're cleaning and the menorah and the miracle and all that. That's on this side of the street. On the other side, there's a war going on. Okay, mamish. Nor, by the way, does Yehuda Maccabee ever take that fort. That fort lasted for decades. Many, many years later, on the 23rd of Iyar, 25, 30 years after this, that the fort finally was captured by another Jewish leader, and that was Megillah's time state. Now, anyway, Judah Maccabee selected priests without blemish, now you need a Kohen without a mum, whose delight was in the law, meaning they were delight was in the Torah. That's from the Tehillim, isn't it? The Torah is Hashem Katz. And they purified the sanctuary, carrying out the stones that had defiled it into an unclean place. So we see, this is the Channuka that we're talking about, the cleaning out, the rededicating of the Beis HaMikdash. They had stones that had been knocked down by the Greeks in their, you know, stripping and trashing operations and whatever else they did there. These stones are tummy. You know, they could have been used by Avodah, they were used by Goyim, whatever it is. These were stones from the Beis HaMikdash, but have become tummy. The rules of Jewish law are that anything which is mechuber l'karka cannot become tummy, even for Avodah. If something is attached to the ground, it doesn't become puzzle, even if it was worshipped. If it's not attached to the ground, then it does. So these stones have been lying around all over the place. And as you see from the description that I just read you, Beis HaMikdash was really, looked horrible. Okay? And they purified the sanctuary carrying out the stones. They took counsel among themselves as to what they should do about the altar of burnt offering which had been defiled. Now this is very interesting. They looked at the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach itself had been carried off and used for gold. But the other Mizbeach, which made out of, the main Mizbeach, was not made out of gold, so it was still there. The Greeks had used it for pagan sacrifices, whenever. Now what do you do? On the one hand, it's not, you can use it. I just explained to you, anything which is mechuber l'karka, which is attached to the ground, cannot become defiled in Jewish law. On the other hand, as we'll see, they could not stand the thought that the most sacred spot for the Jewish people, the Mizbeach, upon which the karbanos had been offered up, that this thing had been defiled, raped as it were, used for, they couldn't even bring themselves to say the word, used for avodah zarah. What should they do with that? And so, a good plan occurred to them, namely to tear it down, lest it become a reproach to them because the heathen had defiled it. This was a good plan. It wasn't required. So what? We're not going to use this Mizbeach. So they tore it down. And they took whole stones, according to the Torah, Avanim Shleimim, and they constructed a new altar like the former one. They built the sanctuary, the interior of the temple. They hallowed, meaning sanctified the courtyards. They made new holy vessels. Now pay attention to this. They made new holy vessels, that's the clay shards, and they brought the candlestick. What's the candlestick? That's the manor. And the altar of incense and table into the temple. Well, they must have made one, but the old one was gone. And they burned incense on the altar and lit the lights in the candlesticks, and it should shed light in the temple. That's the only hint you'll have over here whatsoever of the story of the oil. They don't mention it.
It's interesting.
Wait a second. They put loaves of bread on the table, hung up curtains, finished all the work that they had undertaken to do, so that on the 25th day of the 9th month, meaning this could have been finished a week before Hanukkah, as it were, but they wanted to make the inauguration of the new Beis HaMikdash on the same day that the Goyim had set up they defiled it. This would be really, Diyad Hashem, Mida Keneged Mida. On the 25th day of the 9th month, that is the month of Kislev, the 149th year, they rose early, they offered sacrifices according to the Torah upon the new altar of burnt offering which they had made. At the same time, and on the same day, which the heathen had profaned it, on that very day it was consecrated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell upon their faces and prostrated themselves and uttered praises to heaven who had caused them to prosper. They celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days.
But the oil,
Wait a minute. They celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days. They brought burnt offerings with joy and offered a sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They also adorned the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields, and rededicated the gates of the priests' chambers and fitted them with doors. Thus, there was great joy among the people, and the reproach caused by the heathen was removed. Judah and his brothers and the entire congregation of Israel then decreed that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept with gladness and joy at their due season, year after year, for 8 days, for the 25th of the month of Kislev. At that time they built high walls and strong towers around Mount Zion, so that the enemy could never again come and destroy them as he's done before. Now you know everything that this book has to say about the subject of Hanukkah. That's it. Right? Outside of, this is it. But there is no other source outside of what I'm about to read you about the story of Hanukkah. Just a great problem we always had in history, which is that the best source, so to speak, the most detailed source, described by Hanukkah, there's no mention whatsoever about the oil. On the other hand, if you've followed me so far, let me just say that a year and a half after this, the Greeks recaptured the base of Israel. So whatever was set up was lost again. And it didn't fall in the Jewish hands for a number of years later. Meanwhile, Maccabean himself was killed in battle, and then his brother took him for a while. His brother, wasn't quite, at the very end, his brother was able to take over part of the base of Israel, and he was killed by the Greeks until the last brother finally recovered the entire base of Israel in the Holy Yerushalayim. Okay? So as we see from the book of Maccabees, we get a very good story, but we're missing the famous mindset of the oil. Okay? Any questions?
Well, besides the oil, also, wasn't the following year that they made Hanukkah?
Say it again, please.
It sounds like from this story that year they made Hanukkah, but I thought it was like the following year.
That's true. It says well, I'm about to read you. That Tanur Rabbanan that you're referring to is from the Megillus time.
Well, that's in Shabbat. I thought I learned
It's in Shabbat. The Gemara is quoting from an earlier source. The earlier source is this, Megillus time.
Oh, okay.
That's why I said before. You were here at the beginning. Megillus time is the only book written before the Mishnah. I repeat, it's before the Mishnah. From the Gemara, it says the famous question that you're absolutely right to raise, which is my Chanukah. What exactly is Chanukah celebration about? Rashi says, what's the name? And it's, well, the Tanur Rabbanan, etc., etc., etc. The Tanur Rabbanan is a device in the Gemara which means what? What does Tanur Rabbanan mean? It's quoting a... It's quoting a... It's not a Mishnah, but it's quoting another Tannaitic source. We have the following sources among the Tanakh that are around. There's a Mishnah, there's a Zepta, the Mechilta, the Sfarad, the Sifri, what we call the Mesh Halacha, the Barises, if you wish, which are not organized. And then there's that strange two books, the Dos Tainas and the Seder Olam. You have 8 things to play. Whenever you see Tanur Rabbanan, you have to find out what, if you want to do it right, you have to find out what exactly they quoted. And in this case, we have the source, which I'm about to read to you. And with this, I will, hopefully conclude my remarks in terms of that you will now know what everything the sources have to say about Hanukkah. Now, therefore, I'm not going to read from the Gemara. I'll read from the source that the Gemara quotes, which is much fuller explicated, and it's very, very interesting in terms of our development. Now, again, as I say, the Megillus Tainis is done by months. As you can see here, Elul and Tishrei and Mar Cheshvan and so forth and Kislev. It really pays for the person that's interested to read through the Megillus Tainis, because you see from there that there were that already a month or two earlier, the Jews had captured other parts of the Beis Hamikdash. They had taken possession of the Beis Hamikdash, and they clearly were waiting, for the month of Kislev to make the actual rededication. For example, I'll read you this passage from Cheshvan, 23 Cheshvan, estimated close to Cheshvan, which is a month before Hanukkah. Right? It says, "But Esther b'Klosel Mar Cheshvan is Tavja Serigim in Azrosa." And this day the story was destroyed in the Azor. This is 1 month before Hanukkah, and it says, "Here's Mitnei Shabo Sham Goyim, Abani Sham Goyim Makom Emidu Aleim Zazonos." The Greeks, when they captured the temple, Alexander's time, and they had a citadel across the street, so they set up a place for Znus in the Azor of the Beis Hamikdash. This is part of their whole attitude of contempt. The place was, as you see, trashed, turned into a garbage heap, and worse. So they made a base zonos in the Azor of the base of English. You can't imagine a greater blasphemy. They did it on purpose. We cannot show greater contempt for the traditional Jewish religion than to set up something like this in the place of the most greatest sanctity of the Jewish people.
It's not that wasn't their aim.
You're right. I understand that. Nevertheless, this happened. So the soldiers did whatever it is. The Jews, who said the Jews didn't start this idea? All we know is, like I'm saying, this is what the sources tell us. Okay, should talk for Yad Beis Chashmonai. I mean, we see here, if you follow what I'm saying, from a concatenation of political events, that the Greeks actually got involved one way or another in attacking the Jewish religion. Right? Our whole point was to try to elucidate through the sources how it was that they departed from the norm. And the answer we see is the Jews got them into that. But once they did it, they did it. Okay, should talk about Yad Beis Chashmonai, Megillah's Tainus, when the Maccabees won? No, Tlu Mehem is through. They took it and tore it down, obviously, destroyed it. This base zoners. Well, most of Shemavonim took it, and underneath it, somewhere they found diamonds. But V'nimbalem with guns with some, and they didn't know what to do with them. They considered them traits, so they buried them because of a Zora or something like that. Because they didn't know, is this from the Zonos, from the Greeks, or was this something from the ancient base of English? They didn't know what to do with it. So Geneza, they buried it away until somebody should know what to do with it. And they're told to this day, whenever this book was written. So until Eliyahu or somebody comes to tell us whether they're Tommy or Torah. Yom Shesesru, also Yontif. That day was declared a Yontif. That's a month before Hanukkah. You see that from this alone, the Chashmonaim have taken it there. Now, as I say, to get to the chase, it says on the 25th of Kislev, it's something called Chanukah. Timnya Yomin is 8 days long. Below the mitzvah, we're not allowed to have a hesped. Section. Now I'm going to read you what it says, and I'll ask everyone to pay close attention to this. Section. When the Greeks entered the Beis Hamikdash, they were metame all the oil. When the Chashmonaim came, they could only find one jar, which was untouched, and the seal of the Kohen got along. Right? And then they had the miracle of the 8 days. There was only enough oil for 1 day, and it lasted for 8 days. The following year, they would convey that it should be celebrated for 8 days. Now then it goes on to say, wait a minute. But why 8 days? In other words, all the other Chanukahs always were 7 days. Plus, over here it says, as we know, it's the famous Kasha of Beis Yosef. The first day was no miracle because there was enough oil for 1 day. So this question is obviously not from Beis Yosef, but it's pre-Mishnah. And the answer is no teretz that we find. If we look at the original source, as many are accustomed to come up with long dishes to the but rather to say, Ein Hachinami. Ma'aro las Chanukah Shmona Yom, where's this business of 8 days? Meaning, if it was really a Chanukah model to commemorate, the original Chanukah would have been 7 days. It is not, therefore. So what's it all about? It is not a matter of the miracle of the oil, because for that alone, they made a 1 day celebration. See? You know, when it comes, like all these other days in the Megillah times, every time the 25th day of Kislev comes along, we should remember there was a nace once in the base of English, something with oil. Don't have any fast days on it, and don't have any hespeds on it, and move on. But what's this business of departing from the norm and making an 8 day celebration out of it? When in the times of the Greek kings of Greece, when the Chashmonaim beat them, they came in and they rebuilt. They built an altar and they put it in cement. That's the altar we just spoke about. The Tiknabo Klisharis, and they had to make new kalim. And that was an 8 day thing. Meaning that when they came back, it took them 8 days to fashion a new altar and new kalim. They weren't necessarily fancy, as we'll say in a second, they're basically ad hoc. But they wanted to get the base of English moving somehow or other. And there was it was an 8 day period when they set their goldsmiths and artisans or whatever it is, to use whatever materials at hand to make new klisharis and a new mizbeach and a new whatever they used in the base of English. And in order to commemorate this fact that we're told here, the Chachamim said, never forget those 8 days. Now, to us, it seems like a detail. If you lived at that time, it wasn't a detail. This is very significant. You understand? All the stuff in the Beis Hamikdash had been destroyed. All the kelim in the Beis Hamikdash had been defiled. Most of it had been melted down. The stuff that wasn't melted down was used for pagan purposes. The most horrible thing possible for a Jew. And then they went through a period where everybody got together somehow, we don't know how, and made new ones. They said, well, let us never forget these 8 days, this week-long business, when we make the new ones. And therefore, we're going to also make this holiday, or this time of Chanukah, which is a time not to fast on or to have hespeds on. We'll make it for 8 days. So the 8 days is to commemorate the Misaskim of clay shards that they were making the things in the Beis Hamikdash. Beg pardon?
So what are we lighting 8 days for?
Well, my role is the neighbors. So what's it do with the candles? So Gemara, she made Chanukah. She told me that they want to make a commemoration. All right, make a commemoration. Don't fast and don't have any losers. You want to tell me for 8 days? Okay. What does it do with the candles? Because Chanukah is really different than all these other times, which is just days you're not allowed to fast. There's a whole ritual of candles. So what's that all about? Because the Greeks had gone and metami everything. And they had nothing to light. So when the Chashmonaim came in, that's the answer to your question. That's what I was waiting. They had no time to make a fancy menorah, as you point out, it's very difficult. So they took 7 spears, and they stuck them together, and they plated them with some kind of cheap wood, the bats, so it should look, circa facade. And that was the menorah. And they lit it.
What right do they have to do that? That wasn't specifications that it was supposed to be in there. They have a right to do that?
Good question. That's what they did. Right? Say, I don't mean speciously. Listen to what it says though.
Yeah.
But they did it. Whether you think it was right or wrong, they evidently thought it was right. Let me finish. And they started to light. And that's the menorah of Chanukah that we were talking about with the oil of 8 days and all that thing, right? In other words, it was a cheapo sort of thing. The Gemara of Avodah Zarah says that later on they had a chance, they got a good one. Okay? They got a good one. But I want to tell you something. A good one satisfies the requirements of strictly of the Torah law and of aesthetics and all the rest of it. But that menorah that they built with the spears was the thing that really hit them. You see? They saw the spears and they saw the cheap menorah and they saw the struggle that they had gone through. There wasn't a single family in Klal Yisrael that hadn't lost people. There wasn't a single person there that hadn't been scarred by the struggle. There wasn't anybody that didn't feel the most unbelievable emotion at seeing this. And those people at that time, we're told here, were masaking that from now on, whenever this time of the year comes along, and if for whatever reason we decided to make it 8 days, light a candle every night. And when you look at that candle, don't ever forget that menorah. And don't think that menorah was a cheap menorah or something like that. Because we pay for that in blood. People die for this. And that's not something to forget. Now, this makes very good sense in the following context. The real din originally was 1 candle a night, period. Neri Shubesa, we all know this, right? The real halacha, even today, the halacha l'maisa of Chanukah, to fulfill your legal requirements, is you light a candle in the window every night, or wherever. This business of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 candles is what we call mahadr min mahadr. You want to go very far. You want to be mahadr with the extra medactic in mitzvahs. Actually, we could talk about the term mahadr. Let's do that for a second. As you see, this is what the sources tell us. It goes and tells us, what about Hallel? Why do they make up the thing? They say Hallel, my role is Hallel. Whenever a great nace happens, we're supposed to commemorate with Hallel. And they felt that this was a great nace, that the fact they were able to get back to Beis Hamikdash, who would ever have thought of this a year or two ago, when the Jewish people were at the bottom, and this is something that deserves to be commemorated with Hallel. That's basically what the Megillah's Tainus has to say on the subject. It's very significant, because what it means is this. These remarks will close. What it means is that the original Chanukah was designed around the idea of a combination of 4 events. It was designed, the miracle of oil was not designed to be reenacted as we do today. The reenactment ceremony that has become popular among all of us is mahadr min mahadr. It's a different thing. What we do now by adding lights every night is we reenact the miracle of the oil. when they go like Bishama, like Bisil, you're reenacting them. One candle this night, another candle that night. What are you doing by adding candles? You're not commemorating them, no, you're commemorating the days. Because as you know, every night in the base image, all 7 candles are burning all the time. I mean, if we were literally doing what happened at that time, we'd have 7 candles up for 8 days. Right? We don't do that. So the lighting of the number of the candles is not to make us imitate the menorah, it's through the mechanism of the menorah to enact in a ritualistic fashion, to reenact the days. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, or as Beit Shammai says, 8 days, 7 days, 6 days, whatever. But that's a later development, you see. If this Mahadim means you're reenacting it. Originally, what they wanted to do was light 1 candle in there, and that candle should remind you of the menorah. The menorah, as I say, that was made of a couple pieces of spears, a couple pieces of wood. The 8 days is because those 8 days when they made new kalim, and who knows if the menorah was made out of spears, who knows what the other kalim were made out of. Right? Who knows? But whatever they were made out of, and they probably weren't as fancy as they had been earlier, until they had a chance to do it right. But you know, those people there, every piece that they built in the base of Mikdash, as I say, they purchased with blood and more. And the miracle itself, Bichlal, which set the whole thing off, is the reason for Chanukah in the first place. What remains to us to explain is this difference in the sources between the fact that the book of Maccabees doesn't say anything about the miracle of Yule, and the Chazal, of course, do.
It doesn't say someplace in the war Shabbos about the oil burning more than it was supposed to. They had enough for.
I read that. Yeah, no, it says it was only enough for 1 night. It lasts for 8 nights. It says that here. This is where the Gemara Shabbos is quoting here. You see? But if you followed, I rushed through this last part because we're running out of time. The point is that it was the miracle of the world that set the whole thing off in the first place. Now, there are arguments in the Poskim and the Rishonim that say, you know, the Al-Anisim is more or less designed around the idea of the days of the victory. Okay? This does not hold water from the point of view of history. Because you see, this wasn't a victory, it was just an episode. Shortly afterwards, they lost again. A few years later, Judah Maccabean was killed. It is an episode. It is an episode that has been granted eternal meaning by Chazal, because, the nace you can't take away. Now, why is that mentioned here? That's not clear. The best from answer that's given, the only one that I've ever seen, was by the modern history 100 years ago. The Doris Rishonim, Yitzchak Isaac Levi Benowitz, was more or less the greatest of the Frum historians. He was a person of a very violent temper, wrote all kinds of books against all the other historians and tore them to bits. And his point, and he was fully familiar with what I just outlined to you tonight. And what he says, of course, well, the book of Maccabees, by the time it was published, the Tzaddukim were in power, and they were against all the mitzvahs Rabbanon, or at least many of them. And the idea of the 8 nights in the oil thing is revolving around the idea of a mitzvah Rabbanon, and they were more interested because they were nationalistic in talking about the victories of the Maccabees. So they on purpose downplayed that aspect and wanted to turn Chanukah into more Zionistic, if you will, more nationalistic holiday. That's the answer. You know, we can argue about it back and forth. But I have tried tonight, at least, to give you the basis for argument. And as I say, now you know what the sources that are out there have to say on the subject of Hanukkah. Good luck.
What was the question he asked at the end? The question, I know the answer, I don't have the question.